Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. In its State of the Nigerian Economy report titled Fixing the Crack Walls, Hard Choices, Better Future, published in August, the non-partisan non-profit think tank, the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, highlights a number of critical policies for the administration for the next 2 years, beyond the most recent policy announcements. Some of these proposed reforms by the NESG include rationalizing selected government assets, optimizing government's operating expenditures to reduce leakages, establishing a coordinating body for fiscal and monetary policies, and reforming the operating model of the central bank, as well as growing the non-oil export sector and contribution to the country's GDP. At NESG, Tayo Aduloju is the Chief Executive Officer Designate and Senior Fellow, Economic Policy Strategy and Competitiveness. He's a policy entrepreneur, educator, strategist, futurist, scholar, fourth industrial revolution explorer, and advocate. He has over 2 decades of consulting, strategy, and policy advisory experience that cuts across the major sectors of the economy and the governance value chain. He joins me now to share the NESG's thinking around these policy recommendations and expectations surrounding the forthcoming NESG Summit, now in its 29th year, and themed Pathways for Sustainable Economic Transformation and Inclusion. Wow. That's a lot there. Quite the pedigree.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show, Dr. Aduloju.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. And you've come, your timing is perfect, because you know the first question I'm going to ask you is the news that broke last night that the president had nominated former banker Olayemi Cardoso as the next CBN governor, alongside 4 other deputy governors, many of whom are from financial services. So what is the big thing about this announcement? What does it mean for monetary policy, for policy making by the CBN going forward?
Well, if this was a game of chess, this would be the president aligning his king and knights, right?
Okay.
It sorts the question in people's mind as to how does the president intend to execute economic governance? Because we see, by the way, not just the president appoint the CBN appointees, but he does the FIRS. There seems to be a shift. His SA revenue moves to the Revenue Authority. And then we kind of are beginning to see a set of fiscal and policy authorities that the president has chosen to drive his overall economic governance agenda. So I think this is important, very important announcement. I'm excited about Yemi for a couple of reasons. One is he brings a balance of being a banker, investor, and reformer.
Okay.
Reformer is important because the biggest task he's going to face in the CBN is reforming the institution and then going on to transform and rethink monetary policy fundamentally in terms of a breakaway of how it has been done over the last decade. These are his realities. And so I think you needed to have someone who had the capacity to do both, to think about how to get financial system stability up and running, restore the fundamental role of the central bank as a price stability regulator, and to do so whilst partnering deeply with fiscal policy and other economic policy sectors to be able to create the right level of policy sequence, policy mix, and also policy dynamics that lead to economic transformation, which is what we radically need today.
And, interestingly, he was former Lagos State Commissioner for Economic Planning and Budget. So he has the fiscal sort of side of the experience. But do you have an idea what sort of direction he might take on some of the things that have already been set out in the last few months? We've seen the unification of the exchange rate and some of these other things. Any insights as to...
I think the first thing is to get into the psyche of the presidential state of mind. And we can map it by using a set of parameters. What's the president thinking when he thinks about the economy? I think the first thing is the president thinks he must balance the current account.
Okay.
Right. So that's a big set of issues between how much money I have to spend and how much money I make. And in that one conversation, the president has on one end a set of assets, national assets that are not performing at parity to their international peers as a joke, and then a set of liabilities that have run, basically out of hand to the point where, like he said, debt servicing at 90% to revenue.
And they're pretty much all dollar liabilities.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then you then have the balance sheet itself in terms of the revenue framework and the expenditure framework. So in the president's mind, economic governance will be effective only when he gets these things under control. And so you see that what he did in his first move was to try and do two things simultaneously. One, stop the accelerators. And in his mind, his accelerator of the deficit was the subsidy. And then second accelerator in the market was the multiple exchange rate windows. Now, once you do that, there are other in high inflationary accelerators that have been running for years. Prohibition lists, trade restrictions, new Naira policy that created a cash crunch triggered a food security potential crisis because low cultivation in January.
Yeah, and we're still feeling the effects now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those are accelerators, and those accelerators don't go away because you have a new president. If you didn't cultivate enough food in January, harvesting in June, July, August will mean, you're going to deal with food inflation now. So it seems natural that if that's how the president is thinking, he will want tabs on not just fiscal policy, but monetary policy. But more important is to restore the central bank to its core function. The central bank in the last decade has been drawn into all and sundry as an intervener in a very big way. And we saw it in the Ways and Means, expansionary interventions. We saw it in trying to use this multiple exchange rate windows to deal with certain market structure issues. And I think that just had a runaway effect. Now, as you dial that back, you have real problems because now you have companies looking at their balance sheets and saying, right, I need to restructure my balance sheet. If FX was at 400 and something in January, I'm at 800 and something now, to be able to do business, which means the financial system must change to create more structured, longer term working capital, low interest, low cost,
local currency,
patient investment. So the thing is, you need a banker also. This is where the banking side comes. You need someone that understands what kind of tweaks to make to the financial sector to make it come along the macroeconomic reforms to create first, a less painful easing effect of the market adjustments over the medium to the long term. Yeah,
I mean, we still have a few hurdles to cross with the nomination. Hopefully it gets through the Senate, but there's other legal issues which have been brought up, which we'll not discuss. So we'll see how that situation sort of evolves in the coming days and weeks. So I wanted us to now sort of look at global market conditions. We're pursuing a reform path here locally, but we're not immune from what happens around the world.
Absolutely.
Do you see any sort of signs globally that some of the things that are happening around the world may actually shape how the policy reform drive here happens, and what may be some of those global economic indicators to watch out for?
I think we should be careful about the global politics. First,
global politics.
Yeah. So if you look at the global geopolitics that has played out even on the continent in the last few months, African leaders have been back and forth. We've been China, that was last year, then we were in France, then we were in Russia. And the fact is, African leaders are dealing across board, not Nigeria, with huge fiscal deficits and a very, very tight fiscal space. What that means is that uncompetitive reformers are playing the losing game in the first place, because you're not the only one that needs these resources. It's a very tight Pan-African space. And so an active, willing reformer at home matters more than ever, because you need to be sending all the right signals, not just at home, but across the world, that if there was, if a dollar was up for grabs, as concessionary loans, as grants, as FDI, as whatever, you were the place it needed to go. So that creates a default competitive reform space in Africa. Now, I'm not a great supporter of jumping around the world the way the African leaders have done, but it's what it is, right? The dollars you need is not here, it's there. The opportunities they need is here. And the question is whether Nigeria particularly can strike a good balance between looking at what's happening globally and finding our space.
Well, the president has been now to India, he's been to the UAE, so clearly he's pushing his international economic diplomacy. But some people are arguing that with the state of our debt situation, perhaps we should be courting the IMF and the World Bank more. How do you think those relationships can even be managed to attract the dollars that Nigeria needs for the reform
I
program?
think Nigeria is courting the IMF and the World Bank. Mr. Wale Edun, who is now Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister for the Economy, was at the IMF World Bank meetings earlier in the year, in, I think in an observer capacity, because I think he was the president-elect at that time's nominee to the council, and by default, he had an eye on what was going on. And so I think that there is an ongoing conversation with the IMF and the World Bank.
For debt relief or debt restructuring?
Well, I doubt that the president wants to show up begging. And this goes back to, I think, his philosophy about balancing the current account.
Yes.
Responsible sovereigns balance their current account. It's just that simple. Show up as a responsible sovereign that has done your homework, reduced the waste.
Rather than ask for handouts. Yeah.
Cut the leaks, show you have moved toward more stronger fiscal and monetary efficiency, tighten a bit, and show that you will manage and invest your money differently, bring your assets under alignment, review your sovereign risk framework and the risks that are running away, and bring them under some strategy mitigation, which you see, by the way, with the coordinating minister announcing the winding up of the bad loan bank, AMCON. Yes. Those moves tell the world that a responsible sovereign is ready to do business. And then if you're doing some of that, then you must still deal with your external liquidity problems. We need liquidity. Investments is one great way to get that liquidity in. So the president is becoming our chief investment promoter himself. That's a good thing. We've not had that for some years, and he has the persona for it. And I think wherever the president goes, he wants to answer his economic questions quickly. What gains can I have here economically? And so India was a good outing, I think. If you look at some of the deals have been in the pipeline for a while. And this is something that, as the Honorable Minister for Trade, Investment and Industry settles down, she may want to look at. What was already in the pipeline over the last decade that was stuck? And how do you decouple that? Yeah. Could be some quick wins. Then what in our asset portfolio could be radically transformative? So for example, we've done the hard work with petroleum industry, right? We have the PIA. We have the NNPC Limited. What people are waiting for is, when are we going to go to the market, for example, and make that asset perform? So there are many other assets like that across the country. We have a satellite company that is a limited liability company that we think should be a PLC. So there are many assets that could perform at higher levels of productivity. And I think the president is aware of that. So I think in the first instance, look at what's in the pipeline. And get some of that in. In our estimation, you could easily have $100 to $200 billion worth of deals in pipelines from the past that are stuck by regulation, stuck by just bad policy somersaults, stuck by absence of the right legal framework, sometimes just stuck by politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the thing is, get rid of some of that. That already is very powerful signs that you're ready for business. You will not fix everything at home overnight. But here's the trick. We must get enough liquidity into the system in the next 12 months to ease the pressure. And the CBN is doing its own thing with the question of, do we float? Do we not float? Do we have some managed float? There's all kinds of concepts between the two extremes.
Do you have a view on where we should go with regards to that?
I honestly think that with the MPC's work, there needs to be some more additional intelligence as to how the financial systems are behaving internally.
Okay.
How much insider trading is going on? How much FX internal trading is going on.
Because we have all these intermediaries in the system.
And all these intermediaries are playing a role. And for example, how much is fiscal affecting monetary? So if you issue 180 billion naira to the states for palliatives, some of those palliatives require buying something And if you're going to buy, you're chasing something in dollars. So imagine 25% of that money starts to chase dollars in 24 hours after disbursement. So some of our liquidity problems and our high inflationary problems are created by the fiscal and monetary system needing better intelligence as to how our actions are creating unintended consequences.
And I guess that's why you have a coordinating minister for the economy, because you have to look at all the nuances on both the fiscal and monetary side. And quite a lot of governance reform needs to take place in terms of transparency and accountability.
In fact, we think that the coordinating minister has an opportunity now to implement institutional reforms across all public financial institutions.
Okay.
Because again, there are some public financial institutions that we capitalize with public funds. Money between finance and CBN, several of our national development banks, that simply are not living up to expectation, or need reform, or have been politically sidelined. So if you were a Bank of Agriculture in the last 8 years, all the banking in agriculture was done elsewhere than where you were.
We essentially have to depoliticize the administration of public finances in our institutions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk a bit more about it, but I wanted us to talk about an issue, the socioeconomic inequities, before we talk about NESG. With this reform program, it's easy to imagine that we risk leaving some people behind. Those at the bottom of the pyramid. And that really concerns me. It concerns a lot of Nigerians, because we seem to be espousing sort of a free market capitalist approach, but economic growth has to be inclusive. So what do you think? How can we track both the investor-friendly reforms and still ensure that those who are at the bottom of the pyramid are productive and have the support they need to gainfully contribute to economic growth?
That's not just a great question. That's an imperative. It's a question of, because one, I say to people, all the growth we experienced in the last 2 decades was growth without jobs. If you remember, the biggest narrative out of the Jonathan growth phase was high growth, low jobs, right? So jobless growth has been our characteristic. And one of the reasons is that the sectors that are growing, your high growth sectors, are not labor intensive. Your labor intensive sectors are not high growth. Now, to give you one example, right? Job elasticity between 1999 and 2018 was 0.4, which means of every 10 jobs you created, right, 6 people went into poverty.
Wow.
So you created working poor, which is what makes, of course, the recent National Bureau of Statistics report on unemployment rate, interesting.
With calculated methodology.
Now, interesting methodology, but the point is that you now have created such a large segment of multidimensionally working poor in the new data set that it now becomes problematic. We now discuss the fact that you work but you're poor, right? And that you're living below the extreme poverty line. So this creates a big issue where the imperative is not just economic transformation in terms of growth, it is economic transformation with high labor intensive growth that has labor elasticity.
And what are those sectors that have high labor intensive growth potential?
So here's the thing. A different type of agriculture could have allowed us have both labor intensive and high growth and high job elasticity. In other words, more jobs lift more people out of poverty. Right? But to do that, you must transform agriculture from the way we're doing it currently, which basically is driven by manual labor. It requires mechanization. Mechanization per hectare in Nigeria is 0.2.
Wow.
Our peers, Brazil, India, Mexico, are between 4 HP per hectare to 6 HP per hectare. So you are basically trying to compete on food output with people using hoes and cutlasses, in a global economy where people have numbed out tractors. So that's a big challenge right there. So imagine that we went through a mechanization process for agriculture across the country, right, and moved to, say, about 3 HP per hectare. That on its own will be transformative. Second, we only have about 4% absorption on high yield seeds, 4%. In other words, most of our farmers are planting with low yield seeds, right? So if you want to transform this labor intensive sector to a high growth sector, change the dynamics, deal with seed security. Seed security is not just seeds, it's the type of seeds. Fertilizer security is not just fertilizer, it's a type of fertilizer. Because you have different agroecological zones around Nigeria, they respond to different types of fertilizers, mix a bit of the rest. And then water. One of the biggest national security threats today is a resource scarcity conflict for water and land. And we see that conflict kind of cascade into herder-settler clashes, right? And water is the key. Now, to solve that problem, we must move to planned systemic irrigation, right? We must engineer for irrigation that creates more watered land. These are the things that make a low productivity sector becomes high productivity. Manufacturing is another potential labor intensive sector. But
I mean, we could go into all these sectors because we're going to run out of time, but the case of agriculture is really interesting, and I think one that should be pursued based on how you've explained it. And I know manufacturing is going to be key for jobs creation, but with all of this, I know NESG, the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, is doing a lot of work. And just as we round up, how are you actually shaping national policy making and helping to drive change at that level? You have the summit coming up in October, I believe the 23rd and 24th. So what is really on the agenda, and how will your organization help drive that agenda?
So this year's summit is an agenda-setting summit because it allows new actors at federal, at state, to come together to look at the data for what it is, to sell the agenda, to test the agenda, to explain, expound, and really explore the agenda with the private sector, with civil society, as a way to drive change. So this year's summit, we're calling it Sustainable Pathways to Economic Transformation and Inclusion. So back to your point, the inclusion part, which is carry everybody along. 133 multidimensionally poor Nigerians cannot be left behind, right, in how we transform the economy. But the idea is to use the summit to point to the potential pathways to do so. It's one thing to say, go grow. It's a different thing to say, how do we grow sustainably? What is the sequence to grow? What sectors will help you grow? So everything about the summit of this year, all these are conversations of a capital. We want to dive into, we're going to have plenaries.
And of course, the president will be attending.
Yes, he's graciously, His Excellency Ahmed Bola Tinubu has generously agreed to open the summit, and he will have his own presidential plenary, where he will discuss his own agenda with his economic team. And so that will be exciting to see. And His Excellency, the Vice President, has agreed to close the summit, and he has some ideas about traction and how to hit the ground running. And in between that is we have a commitment for many of the ministers to join us to discuss their specific policy areas. So the summit creates the opportunities to set the agenda. And once the summit is over, the NESG has 12 policy commissions and 44 policy thematic working groups that work all year. So right now we are helping, calling ministers, talking to them about how to settle down, what the priorities are, how to get going. And the idea is if they win, we all win. And so building the country of our dreams was what this summit is about. And it's really about, can we look at the pathways, the specific sequence of pathways, and the options? What are the scenarios for growth? The president has said, I want $1 trillion economy in 2031.
Yes.
Doable, but how?
Doable, hopefully with the help of NESG. I mean, you have quite the task on you, and of course you're CEO designate because you're going to be starting fully as CEO at some point. So we want to thank you.
1st of January.
1st of January, yes. We want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been such an insightful discussion. Wish you the best with the summit.
Thank you.
And with your approaching tenure, hopefully no one will be left behind in this pathway to sustainable economic growth in Nigeria. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.